It was one of those quietly pleasant mornings that only the English countryside could produce. A morning washed clean by the faintest of showers, leaving the hedgerows glistening, and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and lilac. In the village of St. Mary Mead, life moved, as it often did, with unhurried precision. The church bells marked the hour, the milkman clattered down the lane, and Miss Jane Marple, a figure of delicate gentility, sat by her window with embroidery in hand, though her sharp blue eyes noticed everything beyond the lace curtains. From her vantage point, she could see the high street in its full, modest glory, the green with its wooden benches, the post office, and, just beyond the sweet shop, Harper's barber shop. It was a small, respectable establishment with a striped pole out front, and a window displaying various lotions, brushes, and gleaming razors. The shop had recently been taken over by Mr. Leonard Harper, a man of about 45 with slick dark hair and an urbane manner that some villagers found charming and others, notably Mrs. Price Ridley, found quite insufferable. Mr. Harper had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months earlier, and though his razor was steady, his past, as Miss Hartnell once said with a sniff, seemed rather slippery. Still, business was brisk. The men of the village liked a good trim and a touch of pomade, and Harper's chatter was as sharp as his scissors. That very morning, Harper was preparing his shop for the day, humming a tune as he arranged his bottles of bay rum and lavender water. At precisely 10 o'clock, his first customer arrived, Colonel Lucius Pritchard, a retired officer of the Bengal Lancers, well into his 60s, square-jawed, and perpetually red-faced. The colonel was known for two things in St. Mary Mead: his booming voice and his habit of recounting tales of valor that had grown progressively more improbable with each retelling. "Morning, Harper," the colonel barked as he entered. "Thought I'd come in before the heat of the day. Hair's getting out of regulation length, eh?" And Mr. Harper smiled smoothly. "Indeed it is, Colonel. Please, take your seat." "Same as usual." The colonel lowered himself into the large leather chair, sighing contentedly. Yes, the usual. Keep the sides short. I've got the church to committee meeting later. Can't frighten the ladies looking unkempt." Harper chuckled politely, fastening the cape around the colonel's neck. The bell above the door jingled twice more that morning, first for Mr. Edmund Blake, the village solicitor, a reserved bachelor with neatly pressed suits and a quiet voice, and then for Mr. Harold Sims, the young assistant at the post office, who harbored, it was whispered, a certain admiration for the new typist, Miss Clara Dunn. By 11:30, Miss Marple had finished her embroidery, and made her way to the village green, where she intended to stop by the grocer's and perhaps treat herself to a scone at the Bluebird Café. As she passed the barber's shop, she caught a glimpse through the window, the colonel reclining in the chair, eyes closed, while Mr. Harper leaned over him with a razor. A trusting man, thought Miss Marple with quiet amusement. Heaven help him if his barber ever developed a temper. The remark, idle though it was, would soon prove chillingly prophetic. Shortly after midday, the peaceful hum of the village was broken by a shriek so piercing that it startled even the sparrows from their perch. Miss Marple, who was standing near the post office at the time, turned sharply. The sound had come from Harper's barber shop. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered outside, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Weatherby the grocer, and young Harold Sims among them. Inside, chaos reigned. Mr. Harper stood pale and trembling, his hands streaked with shaving cream, staring in horror at the chair, and at Colonel Pritchard, who sat slumped forward motionless, the white barber's cape stark against his crimson face. "My word," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "He's dead." Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was summoned at once, and within minutes he arrived, brisk and composed. After a brief examination, he straightened up, his expression grave. "He's gone," he said quietly, "and not from natural causes, I fear." Miss Marple, who had been standing discreetly near the doorway, watched everything with calm, unflinching eyes. "Poison?" asked Mr. Harper in a shaking voice. "Surely not, doctor. He was just sitting there. I hadn't even finished his shave." Dr. Haydock hesitated, glancing at the razor, then the bottles on the shelf. "We'll see soon enough. But this is no fainting spell, Harper." The man's heart stopped, suddenly, violently. By now, the constable, Sergeant Pollard, had arrived, flustered but earnest. He ushered everyone out, locked the shop, and set off for the manor to inform Inspector Craddock, who was in the area on a separate matter. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. Her gaze moved from the shop window to the barber's hands, trembling, white-knuckled. then to the faint smell of almonds that drifted through the open door. "Curious," she murmured softly, "very curious indeed." That evening, word of the Colonel's death travelled faster than wildfire through St. Mary Mead. By supper, every household was whispering theories. Price, Ridley swore she had always suspected Mr. Harper of foreign ways. Miss Hartnell insisted that it was undoubtedly heart failure brought on by overeating. Mr. Weatherby, the grocer, declared it a clear case of murder by jealousy, though he couldn't say whose jealousy exactly. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, her cat curled beside her, thinking deeply. She had known Colonel Pritchard for many years. A man of bluster and vanity, yes, but not without charm. Yet she also knew that where there was gossip in a village, there was usually truth hidden beneath the embroidery of imagination. At 8:30, a knock came at her door. It was Inspector Craddock, tall, courteous, and with a hint of dry humour that Miss Marple found agreeable. "I hoped you might spare me a few minutes, Miss Marple," he said. "You heard about the unfortunate business at the Barber's." "I did indeed," she replied, motioning him to a chair. "Poor Colonel Pritchard, such a robust man too." "Robust, yes," said Craddock, taking a seat, "and according to Dr. Haydock, perfectly healthy, no sign of illness. He suspects poison, possibly something introduced into the shaving cream or tonic." "Eh?" said Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly. "Cyanide, perhaps." The smell was quite noticeable, even from the doorway. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You have a sharp nose, Miss Marple." "One must, Inspector," she said mildly. "It helps with gardening, and with human nature." Craddock smiled faintly. "You may be onto something. We'll know more when the analysis comes back. In the meantime, I'm trying to piece together who had reason to wish the Colonel dead." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, that is usually the heart of the matter. In St. Mary Mead, motives are rarely grand. They are domestic, small, but no less deadly for it." Craddock took out a notebook. "Harper swears he's innocent, and he seems genuinely shocked, but the poison must have come from somewhere in his shop. Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "someone put it there." Craddock looked up. "You mean before the Colonel arrived?" "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps the poison was not meant for the Colonel at all." The fire crackled softly as Miss Marple poured tea. "You know, Inspector, I've always believed that murder, like embroidery, reveals the character of the person who commits it. The pattern may appear simple, but one must look closely at the stitching." Craddock leaned forward. "Then perhaps you'll assist me in examining the pattern of this one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I shall do what I can." Outside, the village slept under a silver moon, unaware that beneath its tranquil surface, old secrets and new dangers were beginning to stir, and somewhere in the quiet darkness of St. Mary Mead, someone, perhaps with trembling hands, perhaps with cold precision, was already preparing their next move. The following morning dawned pale and damp, the kind of weather that seemed to encourage both introspection and gossip. Mary Mead had not seen such excitement since the vicar's wife discovered a ring of counterfeit coins hidden in the churchyard years ago. Every doorstep, every queue at the grocer's was alive with conjecture about the dreadful business at the Barber's. At the Bluebird Cafe, Mrs. Price, Ridley was already in full command of a small audience. "I said to him only last week," she declared, her voice loud enough to reach the teapot display, "that man Harper was altogether too smooth. A man with slick hair is never to be trusted, I always say." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "He's foreign, that's the trouble. There's something continental about him." Miss Weatherby, who had only come in for a bun, murmured, "He's from Birmingham." "Precisely," said Mrs. Price, Ridley triumphantly, as if this confirmed everything. At that very moment, the bell above the cafe door jingled delicately, and Miss Marple entered, her manner unhurried, her eyes bright with quiet amusement. She took a seat near the window and ordered tea and a scone, listening with the air of someone who was merely interested in the weather, though every word, every tone of voice, was carefully filed away in her mind. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Price Ridley, clearly pleased with her audience. "Such a to yesterday, wasn't it? Frightful business, poor Colonel Pritchard. I dare say you heard?" "I did indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Most distressing. The Colonel was a man of strong character." "Strong temper, you mean," said Miss Hartnell. "He had words with Mr. Harper only last month, you know. Something about his bill, I believe." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "How interesting." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, and I hear from my maid that Mr. Blake, the solicitor, was seen going into the Barber's just before the Colonel. What he was doing there, heaven knows. He hasn't much hair to speak of." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, there are many reasons a man might visit a barber's, Mrs. Price Ridley. Some go for conversation more than for a trim." The ladies tittered, and the conversation drifted to other subjects, the theft, the new curate's sermon, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the small details. Mr. Blake before the Colonel. A quarrel over a bill, a man of temper, a barber of secrets. By noon, Miss Marple had paid a discreet visit to Dr. Haydock, who was only too happy to share his findings. "It's poison, no doubt about it," he said grimly, wiping his spectacles. "Hydrogen cyanide. A whiff of the stuff is enough to finish a man off in seconds." "Eh?" said Miss Marple softly. "Then it must have been in something he inhaled or ingested during the shave." "Precisely. I found traces on the shaving brush, though not much. Could have been mixed into the lather." "Curious," said Miss Marple. "One would think the barber himself might have succumbed as well, had it been too concentrated." Haydock nodded. "Unless, of course, it was applied at the last moment, perhaps on the razor, or a dab of lotion after the shave. But Harper swears he hadn't reached that stage yet." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Then the poison must have been introduced very close to the time of death. And very deliberately. It's not the sort of thing one keeps lying about." She thanked the doctor and left, her mind ticking quietly. Cyanide, bitter almonds, sudden collapse, instant death. It was efficient, yes, but also rather impersonal. Not the sort of method one used in passion. This was something else, calculated, premeditated. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled down to the high street. Harper's barber shop was still closed, though the blinds had been drawn back slightly. Through the glass she could see Inspector Craddock and Sergeant Pollard inside, examining shelves and bottles. Craddock noticed her and came to the door. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Out for a walk?" "Just taking the air, Inspector. Though I confess, I do find the progress of your investigation fascinating." Craddock smiled faintly. "I thought you might. Care to step in for a moment?" The shop smelled faintly of disinfectant and hair tonic. The leather chair, where the Colonel had breathed his last, looked ominously ordinary. "We've tested nearly everything in here," Craddock said. "So far, nothing's conclusive, but there's a bottle of shaving lotion that seems to have been tampered with. Harper claims he never touched it yesterday." Miss Marple's eyes moved over the shelves. Neat rows of bottles, combs, brushes, and finally to the back of the room, where a small door led to Harper's private quarters. "And how is Mr. Harper bearing up?" "Not well. He's been questioned and released for now. Says he's being framed. Claims someone must have slipped in when his back was turned." "Possible," murmured Miss Marple. "But unlikely. Barbers are not in the habit of leaving their shops unattended." She looked again at the chair, then at the counter, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Still, human beings are ever so careless about the little things, aren't they, Inspector? And yet, it's the little things that tell the truth." Craddock sighed. "You're thinking of something." "Only of the Colonel," said Miss Marple mildly. "He was a man who liked to win arguments. I wonder, did anyone ever let him lose gracefully?" Later that evening, Miss Marple received a visitor, Mr. Edmund Blake, the village solicitor. He was a tall, spare man, impeccably polite, though his manner was rather nervous tonight. "Miss Marple," he began, after she had offered tea, "I thought it best to call on you myself, before rumors get out of hand. You see, I was at Harper's yesterday morning, just before the Colonel's appointment." "Were you indeed?" said Miss Marple calmly. "And did you notice anything unusual?" Blake hesitated. "Only that the Colonel seemed agitated. He came in while I was paying Harper for a bottle of hair tonic. He was muttering something about a letter. Very upset." "A letter?" "Yes, said it was anonymous. Claimed someone had accused him of." He stopped. "Well, of something improper, I imagine." He waved it about, crumpled it, and said he meant to find the writer and give him a piece of his mind. "How very human," said Miss Marple softly. "And did he say whom he suspected?" "Harper, I think. Or possibly young Sims from the post office. He was in the shop at the time and turned quite red." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Sims, a young man of delicate sensibilities, and I dare say, romantic inclinations." Blake smiled weakly. "Yes, I believe he's rather taken with that new typist at the vicarage." "Miss Clara Dunn," said Miss Marple promptly. "Pretty gentle, but not without sense." The sort of girl men underestimate. Blake blinked. You seem to know everyone's character in this village, Miss Marple. Oh, one observes, she said simply. And human nature, Mr. Blake, is much the same whether in St. Mary Mead or Mayfair. That night, as rain pattered softly against the window, Miss Marple sat in her armchair reviewing what she knew. Colonel Pritchard, a man with enemies and a temper. Mr. Harper, new in the village, with a quarrel over payment. Mr. Blake, who saw the colonel receive a letter that enraged him. Young Sims, flustered in the barber's shop that morning. Miss Dunn, quietly at the periphery of it all, observant, unnoticed. Each piece fit neatly on the board, yet the pattern was still obscured. Poison in the shaving cream, Miss Marple murmured. But how was it placed there, and by whom? A letter of accusation and argument, and the scent of almonds. She smiled faintly. When one smells almonds, one must think of cyanide, and when one thinks of cyanide, one must think of premeditation. Outside, the church clock struck 11. Somewhere across the lane, a curtain moved, just the faintest flicker of motion, as if someone were watching. Miss Marple noticed, though she made no sign. She leaned back, folded her hands, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I believe, will be a most enlightening day." The rain that had fallen through the night left the morning washed clean and strangely silent. A mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, blurring the edges of the cottages, and turning the church steeple into a ghostly spire. It was, Miss Marple thought as she stirred her porridge, the sort of morning when truth could hide itself easily behind a veil. At 9 o'clock, there came a timid knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Miss Clara Dunn, the vicarage typist, standing on the step, pale, anxious, and clutching her handbag as though it were a lifeline. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice trembling, I didn't know who else to speak to. You see, they're saying terrible things in the village, about Mr. Harper, and even about Harold." "Do come in, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly, guiding her to the fireside chair. "A cup of tea first, I think. It's much easier to discuss dreadful things when one's hands are occupied." Clara smiled faintly and accepted the cup, her fingers still shaking. "It's just, Harold was so upset after what happened. He said he only went in to get a trim, but Colonel Pritchard accused him of something dreadful. Said he'd written a letter. Harold swore he hadn't, but the colonel was furious, said he'd ruin him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "A letter? Yes, I've heard something of that. Anonymous, wasn't it?" Clara nodded miserably. "Yes. The colonel said it accused him of taking money from the British Legion Fund. It's a lie, of course, but Harold said he saw him tear it up and throw it in the waste bin." "Did he now?" said Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically. "And this was in the barber's shop?" "Yes, just before Mr. Blake left." Miss Marple's tone was neutral, but her mind sharpened. A letter, torn and discarded, perhaps a fragment still remained. She set her cup down. "My dear, you've been very helpful. Tell Harold not to worry too much. Truth, like cream, has a way of rising to the top." Clara managed a watery smile and took her leave. As soon as she had gone, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, and made her way towards the high street. The barber's shop, still sealed by police tape, stood quiet. Inspector Craddock emerged as she arrived, looking thoughtful. "Ah, Miss Marple. You've caught me in the act of brooding. I always find brooding a most productive pastime, Inspector," she said cheerfully. "Have you found anything new?" Craddock sighed. "Only this." He held up a small envelope, torn and smudged. "Recovered it from the waste bin near the chair. Half the words are missing, but it's enough to see what it was. An anonymous note accusing the colonel of embezzlement." "How very unpleasant," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet, so conveniently timed. You think someone planted it, or someone wanted to provoke the colonel into a scene," she said gently. "He was a man who did not bear provocation well, and if he died shortly after receiving this letter, the timing is rather too neat to be coincidence." Craddock frowned. "But why kill him in such a public way? In a barber's chair, of all places?" Said Miss Marple. "That is precisely what makes it so clever. No one suspects a barber's shop, such a safe, domestic setting. The act itself disappears beneath the ordinary. By afternoon, word spread that the colonel's will had been opened. Mr. Blake, acting as solicitor, announced that most of the estate, a modest sum and a cottage, was to pass to a distant niece in Devon. Yet, curiously, a smaller sum of 500 had been left to one Mr. Leonard Harper, in gratitude for services rendered. The reaction in the village was immediate and explosive. £500, exclaimed Mrs. Price Ridley at the post office. Well, that proves it, doesn't it? He killed the Colonel for the money. Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. Though why the Colonel should leave him anything at all is a mystery. He was always complaining about the cost of a shave. Miss Marple, who had entered just in time to hear this exchange, merely smiled faintly. Ah, but men of pride are also men of impulse. Perhaps the Colonel had occasion to be grateful. Once, she purchased her stamps and left, but her mind was humming. A barber gifted money by his dead client, a letter that stirred outrage, and poison placed with precision. It was almost too neatly arranged. That evening, she invited Inspector Craddock to tea. The table was laid with buttered scones, raspberry jam, and a pot of strong Assam. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began, "that we've all been looking at this matter from the wrong angle. We assumed the poison was meant for the Colonel. But what if it wasn't?" Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You mean Harper was the intended victim?" "Possibly. Or someone else entirely. You see, Inspector, in villages such as ours, spite is often more potent than greed." She sipped her tea. "Consider. Harper quarrels with the Colonel, yes, but he also has an admirer or two. Miss Dunn speaks of him kindly. And there's talk that Mrs. Pritchard, the Colonel's widow, visited the shop rather often, even when she had no reason to." Craddock nearly dropped his scone. "The widow? You think she and Harper?" Miss Marple gave a tiny amused smile. "My dear Inspector, I think nothing. Yet, but people are rarely so discreet as they imagine." The next morning brought fresh uproar. Mrs. Pritchard herself, elegant in morning black and a faint veil, had been found collapsed in her sitting room after breakfast. The doctor was called and found her dazed but alive. "Poisoning," said Dr. Haydock grimly as Miss Marple and Craddock arrived. "Arsenic by the look of it, but in a very small dose. Someone meant to frighten her, not kill her." Mrs. Pritchard, pale and trembling, clutched Miss Marple's hand. "It's that letter," she whispered. "There's another one. It was on my breakfast tray this morning. Said I'd get what my husband got." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Then someone wishes you to believe that the same hand struck twice. How cruel." She looked at Craddock. "Inspector, I think it's time we consider the possibility that our murderer enjoys playing with appearances, poison, letters, whispers, all designed to create fear." Craddock nodded grimly. "But who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where a figure stood outside speaking with the constable, Mr. Blake, his face unreadable. "There," she said softly, "a man who deals in documents and secrecy, and one who knew precisely when the will would be read." That evening, Miss Marple went walking in the lane, her shawl drawn tightly around her. The air smelled of damp grass and smoke from the chimneys. As she passed the barber's shop, a faint glimmer caught her eye, light moving inside, though it should have been empty. Quietly, she crossed the road and peered through the side window. Inside, Harold Sims was rummaging through a drawer, his face pale, his movements desperate. Miss Marple tapped lightly on the glass. Harold froze, then turned, his expression one of pure panic. A moment later, he came to the door trembling. "Miss Marple, I can explain. I've no doubt you can, my dear," she said calmly. "But perhaps you'd better do so while we walk." They walked along the lane beneath the gas lamps, Harold's words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't poison him. I swear it. I came here because I thought there might be some clue, to prove it wasn't me. The Colonel was shouting at me that morning, said I'd written the letter. But I didn't. I only posted it. Someone handed it to me at the counter." "Someone," said Miss Marple quietly. "Oh, I don't know. It was in an envelope already. I just thought it was ordinary post." Miss Marple stopped, looking at him closely. "And you didn't recognize the handwriting?" "No, it was typed." She smiled faintly. "Ah, type. How very modern. And of course, Miss Dunn is the only typist in the village, isn't she?" Harold blinked. "Clara, no. She'd never." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple softly. "But someone may have used her typewriter." When Miss Marple returned home that night, she found Inspector Craddock waiting on her porch. "We've traced the bottle of lotion," he said grimly. "It was purchased 2 weeks ago from a chemist in Much Benham, not by Harper, but by a man matching Mr. Blake's description." Miss Marple smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Ah, then I think the pattern is nearly complete, Inspector. The last stitch, as it were." Craddock frowned. "You've solved it." "Not entirely," she said, removing her gloves. "But I know who killed the Colonel, and why." She looked up at him, her expression grave. "And tomorrow morning, Inspector, we shall prove it." The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, gilding the thatched roofs and casting long, honey-colored shadows across the cobblestones. The village appeared serene, but beneath the surface, whispers spread like ripples across a pond. Hargreaves' sudden death had unsettled even the most unflappable souls. Yet Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly in her chintz armchair, a teacup in one hand and her knitting in the other, had that particular glint in her blue eyes that always meant her mind was spinning faster than her needles. That morning, she had visited the barber's shop once again, under the guise of inquiring after poor Mrs. Hargreaves. In reality, she had been there to look, really look, at the little details that everyone else had missed. The chair itself stood almost reverently, draped with a white cloth as though in mourning. The faint scent of bay rum still lingered, mingled now with the sterner odor of disinfectant. Miss Marple had leaned slightly forward, her keen eyes scanning every inch of the mirror, the basin, the shelf of tonics and razors. Then she had noticed it. Something so very small, yet so telling. A tiny residue of white powder had settled in the crevice where the shaving brush met its handle. She had drawn out her handkerchief, dabbed lightly, and murmured to herself, "Yes, quite so. How very curious." Later that day, in the vicarage drawing-room, Inspector Craddock sat opposite Miss Marple with a frown furrowing his brow. "I tell you, Miss Marple," he said, "this case makes less sense the more I look at it. The poison found in Mr. Hargreaves' system was a form of digitalis, heart medicine, but no one recalls him taking it, and there's no prescription in his name." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Digitalis, you say? Yes, quite a convenient poison, wouldn't you agree? Common in gardens, easy to disguise in tincture form, and, most importantly, quite difficult to trace in small quantities." Craddock leaned forward. "You think someone administered it deliberately?" Miss Marple smiled that gentle, infuriating smile that often meant she already knew far more than she was saying. "My dear Inspector, I should hardly call it deliberate. I should call it clever." He sighed. "You've something on your mind, haven't you?" "Oh yes," she said softly. "Several somethings. Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Mr. Hargreaves' private customers, those who came to the shop after hours?" Craddock blinked. "After hours? Yes, I'm told he would sometimes keep the shop open late for certain gentlemen, usually on Thursdays. Confidential visits, one might say." Craddock frowned deeper. "I'd heard a whisper of that from Mrs. Price Ridley, but I assumed it was just gossip." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "My dear man, gossip is often merely unpolished truth." By early evening, Miss Marple had invited 3 people to tea. Mrs. Hargreaves, pale and tremulous, Colonel Melrose, looking uncomfortably large in her dainty parlour, and Mr. Basil Kent, the local solicitor whose polished manners hid a perpetually worried expression. When they were all seated, Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace, all warmth and domestic serenity. Only those who knew her well could tell when that serenity was merely the calm before revelation. "My dear Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple began kindly, "you must forgive me for intruding upon your grief. I merely wish to understand what might have weighed upon your husband's mind before his death." Mrs. Hargreaves dabbed her eyes. "He was anxious, Miss Marple. Very anxious these last weeks. He said he had made an error in judgment some time ago, one that might come back to haunt him." "An error?" He didn't say more, only that it concerned a matter of honor. At this, Colonel Melrose shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "If I might say, Miss Marple, Hargreaves once told me something rather odd. About Mr. Basil Kent here." Kent stiffened, color rising in his cheeks. "Colonel, I hardly think—" No, let him speak," said Miss Marple softly, her gaze fixed upon Kent's trembling hands. Melrose went on. "Hargreaves mentioned that Kent had come to him late one Thursday night. Wanted a trim, so he said. But they argued. Voices raised. Hargreaves told me later that he'd been asked to keep something quiet, some sort of document that had gone missing." A Kent's teacup rattled in its saucer. "This is absurd. Hargreaves was mistaken. I never—" "Oh, but you did," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You see, Mr. Kent, the barber's chair was positioned just so, and the mirror above it reflected the small cabinet behind him. When I looked this morning, I saw faint indentations in the wood, the marks of a key having been turned quite recently. I imagine Mr. Hargreaves had something locked away there." Kent's voice dropped to a whisper. "He was blackmailing me." There was a stunned silence. Miss Marple merely nodded. Yes, I thought as much. But not for money, was it? Kent shook his head miserably. No, for silence. Years ago, when I was a young clerk, I handled a will improperly. The mistake could have cost me my practice. Hargreaves somehow came into possession of a copy, said he'd keep it for safekeeping, as long as I helped him from time to time. A legal favor here and there. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Until, perhaps you grew tired of being used. I didn't kill him. Kent cried. I swear it. I went to see him that evening, yes, but he was alive when I left. We argued, but I never touched him. Indeed, said Miss Marple calmly. I believe you. The poison was not administered that night. It was applied, most cleverly, during his last shave the next morning. There was a soft gasp. Mrs. Hargreaves' hands clutched the edge of the table. But who? Who could have done such a dreadful thing? Miss Marple turned her gaze upon her. That, my dear, is precisely the question. Mr. Hargreaves prided himself on his routine. He would rinse his brush, lather the soap, and warm the razor. Always in that order. Only one person could have interfered with that brush before he used it. Her eyes flicked toward Mrs. Hargreaves. No, the woman cried. You think I? Never. I loved Leonard. Miss Marple's tone remained kind. Oh, I don't doubt you loved him, Mrs. Hargreaves. But love, you see, sometimes turns into something else when a secret is at stake. You knew about the blackmail, didn't you? Mrs. Hargreaves trembled. He told me only recently. Said he meant to confess everything. He'd written a letter. I burnt it, Miss Marple. I couldn't let his name be ruined. Miss Marple murmured, yes. But you see, that letter wasn't about the blackmail at all. It was about something rather worse. The room fell utterly still. He discovered, Miss Marple continued, that someone had been forging his customers' checks. Small amounts, but regular. He suspected your lodger, Mr. Edwin Pratt, the young man from the bank. The same Mr. Pratt who left the village the day after the murder. Colonel Melrose frowned. By Jove, he did vanish rather quickly. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Mr. Pratt had opportunity. He often fetched hot water for the shaves. He had access to the brush. But when I examined it, I noticed something subtle. The powder residue was underneath the dried lather. Meaning it was placed there the night before, not that morning. She looked at Mrs. Hargreaves again. Your husband never reused his brush without washing it, did he? Mrs. Hargreaves' lips parted, then closed again. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. You placed the poison there while tidying the shop after he'd gone to bed. You thought it would ease his pain. A swift, gentle end before disgrace could touch him. A sob broke from Mrs. Hargreaves. He couldn't bear the shame, Miss Marple. I thought it was mercy. Miss Marple's voice softened. Mercy perhaps, but also fear. You wished to spare yourself the humiliation of scandal, but you see, my dear, truth has a way of surfacing, rather like cream in milk. Inspector Craddock, who had arrived midway through the confession, removed his hat solemnly. I'll have to take her in, Miss Marple. Miss Marple sighed. Yes, I'm afraid so, though be gentle with her. She's suffered already. As Mrs. Hargreaves was led away, Miss Marple looked out the window at the golden light fading over the village. Such tragedy, she murmured. And all from something so small. A touch of powder on a shaving brush. It's extraordinary how often evil hides behind ordinary things, isn't it? Craddock nodded gravely. You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Inspector, I assure you, I'm quite frequently amazed myself, though seldom surprised. It was a week after the arrest, and St. Mary Mead had returned, at least outwardly, to its tranquil rhythm. The vicarage garden once more hummed with bees, the clink of teacups sounded merrily from open windows, and the gossip at the post office had shifted, as gossip always does, from tragedy to triviality. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her parlour window, continued to dwell upon the matter of poor Mr. Hargreaves and his unfortunate end. In the quiet of the afternoon, Inspector Craddock called again, hat in hand, his face softened by respect and perhaps a touch of admiration. I wanted to thank you personally, Miss Marple, he said. The Home Office chap said your deductions were spot on. Digitalis slipped into the lather the night before. You noticed what none of us did. Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting down her knitting. My dear Inspector, it was hardly deduction, merely a matter of observation. People so often reveal more than they intend, don't you find? He chuckled. I dare say you're right. Still, it's tragic. Mrs. Hargreaves didn't mean harm. Thought she was sparing him disgrace. Indeed, Miss Marple said gently. but good intentions can be far more perilous than malice. In the end, it was not hatred that killed poor Mr. Hargreaves, but love distorted by fear. Craddock nodded slowly. And the young man Pratt? They've found him in London. He's confessed to the forgeries but swears he had nothing to do with the death. Quite true, Miss Marple said calmly. He's guilty of dishonesty, not of murder. One sees that sort of thing more often than one might wish. Ambition without conscience. Still, I rather imagine he'll learn his lesson. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. The air carried a sweetness after light rain, and the lamps in the cottages glowed like soft amber eyes. Passing the now shuttered barber's shop, she paused, peering through the lace curtains that still hung in the window. The chair stood exactly as it had the morning of the tragedy, though now it seemed more like a monument than a piece of furniture, a silent witness to folly and secrets. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves in her cell, of Basil Kent's trembling guilt, of Colonel Melrose's red-faced indignation, and of all the smaller lies and kindnesses that made up village life. Human nature, she murmured, is a most complex fabric. Pull one loose thread and the entire weave may unravel. From across the street came the click of a latch and the cheerful bark of a dog. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend, emerged from her garden gate, waving. "My dear Jane, you've been quite the talk of the village again. I don't suppose you mind being called the terror of murderers." Miss Marple smiled. "I'm not sure I deserve the title, dear Dolly. I merely notice things." Mrs. Bantry joined her on the pavement, linking arms. "Still, how you saw through it all. I'd never have thought of that dreadful shaving brush. I always say you'd make Scotland Yard look foolish, if only they'd give you an office." "I should find it dreadfully tiring," Miss Marple said, amused. "Besides, crimes are rarely solved by offices. They're solved by people, because people, you see, always behave like themselves, even when they try not to." The two friends walked slowly toward the square, their conversation turning from murder to the forthcoming church FT, to dahlias and sponge cakes, and the new curate's rather endearing awkwardness. Life, as it always does in St. Mary Mead, quietly went on. A few days later, a small envelope arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. The handwriting was elegant but shaky. It was from Mrs. Hargreaves, sent from Holloway Prison. Inside was a short letter. "My dear Miss Marple, you were right, of course. Leonard had discovered the forgeries and meant to report them. I couldn't bear to see his good name ruined after all he had worked for. I only wished to spare him shame. Perhaps in another life I shall learn the difference between mercy and cowardice. Please tend the rosebush he once planted near the shop. It was his pride and joy. Yours sincerely, Edith Hargreaves." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and looked out at her own garden, where the roses were beginning to bloom. The rain had left droplets like diamonds upon the petals, and the air carried that faint, sweet scent that reminded her of youth and endings. She whispered softly, "Poor soul. She loved him too much to let him live." The following Sunday, the vicar's sermon made gentle reference to forgiveness and the dangers of pride. The congregation filled the pews, hats and parasols, and murmured hymns mingling under the old stone arches. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her eyes half closed as she listened. To others, she seemed merely a kindly spinster, a dear old lady fond of her knitting and her garden, but within that quiet exterior beat a mind that saw truth as clearly as the morning sun through stained glass. After the service, Colonel Melrose approached her, moustache bristling. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple. Though if I may say so, splendid work on your part. Can't think how you do it." "Oh, I'm sure you could, Colonel," she said with a twinkle. "It's all rather like gardening, you know. You must tend to the soil, remove the weeds, and sooner or later, the truth begins to grow." He looked baffled, but Miss Marple merely smiled and turned toward the churchyard, where the daffodils were nodding in the breeze. That afternoon, she did as Mrs. Hargreaves had asked. She walked to the old barber's shop, now quiet, its blinds drawn, and found the rosebush at the side wall, a delicate pink variety, slightly overgrown, petals fluttering like small handkerchiefs. She bent down, trimmed the edges, and loosened the earth with her gloved hands. As she worked, she reflected on the curious nature of justice. The law would deal with Mrs. Hargreaves, of course, yet Miss Marple knew that true punishment had already begun, not behind bars, but within a heart that could never again find peace. When she was done, she stood, brushing off her gloves, and looked around the village square. The afternoon light bathed everything in gold. Children played with hoops, a milk cart rattled by, and from the tea shop came the familiar laughter of friends reunited over gossip. Yes, St. Mary Mead, ever resilient, had resumed its gentle heartbeat. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, a soft fire crackling and her knitting basket at her side. The clock ticked serenely, the way it always had. She reflected, as she so often did, on the curious contrasts of human nature, love and deceit, duty and fear, guilt and forgiveness. She thought of the barber's chair, of the mirror that had reflected both vanity and truth, and of the lives that had intersected there so fatally. It was, she mused, a perfect reminder that in even the most ordinary places, sin can sit quietly, waiting for someone observant enough to notice. Lifting her teacup, she smiled faintly to herself. In the end, she murmured, people are so very much alike, whether in London drawing rooms or village barbershops. The motives differ little. Pride, greed, love or fear. The trick, you see, is to listen for what they do not say. She took a sip, the tea fragrant and comforting, and returned to her knitting. Outside, the church bell chimed the hour, the last sound of day blending into the hush of evening, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, as if St. Mary Mead itself were exhaling after the storm.